Hello, everyone. Right.
Hey.
Hey. Hi, guys.
Go on, Matt Sam.
We are live. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for this amazing festival on co-creating change for the arts. I am I know you think you're in the Australia panel. It was meant to be Australia, but unfortunately, Tanya Canis could not make it. But luckily, honestly, I'm so excited for this conversation because I called a very good friend of mine, Tim, and said, Tim, you need to do me a solid. And she did. So, and we've got the wonderful Louis VI here. So I'm going to just do run through bios. So Thimali Kodikara is series producer and co-host of the groundbreaking podcast, Mothers of Invention, feminist solutions to the climate crisis. If you have not heard the podcast, please go and link up because it is honestly a wonderful podcast. Alongside her co-host, former Irish President Mary Robinson and comedian Maeve Higgins, Thimali interviews Black and Indigenous POC women from across the world on their innovations to avert climate catastrophe from the front lines. Thimali has negotiated both cultural and justice partnerships with diverse allies, including 350.org, Stella McCartney, the American Museum of Natural History, New York, and Senator Bernie Sanders, who appeared on the show. She's advised global climate organizations on how to adopt intersectional feminist principles in their climate communications, and was recently invited to consult on BAFTA's climate education program. So her work's been featured in New York Times, Columbia Journalism, BBC NewsHour, and she's just an all-round very good human person that I love. So I'm so pleased she's here. And we have Louis Butler in the house as well, Louis VI. Louis VI is a mixed-race rapper, musician, award-winning film composer and zoologist, climate activist, and award-winning environmental documentary maker and presenter. He's foremost described as the biggest nature geek in London. I love that. After the small Caribbean island of Dominica, where Louis' father's side draws from ancestry, was hit by the Hurricane Maria in 2017, Louis found himself profoundly moved by the injustice of the fact that the places that have contributed the least to climate change are already feeling it the most. I feel that. With a focus on empowering people of colour in climate activism, nature, and creating representation for people of colour within environmental spaces, activism. And this is Louis does this through film and music and has been working tirelessly. I can't.
I'm so sorry about the wording.
He's been doing the hard work, okay? That's what we're getting across. You are doing the hard work to promote and understand.
I'm so sorry.
That's fine. No, it's me. It's my terrible reading. To promote and understand what the diaspora here in the West, so where we live is destroying where we're from. And I think that is such a important context actually to this conversation that you guys are about to have, because this is today is the International Festival arm. So we've got global speakers from across the world. And one of the key things really I wanted to talk about is, for both of you, I want to ask you, what does social change in the art industries look like for you? Both of you are doing some amazing work out there, particularly around climate justice. So
Mothers of Invention is a podcast, as you said, on feminist solutions to the climate crisis. It's not a standard information share as a lot of media tends to be. It is unique in that I write and develop an editorial strategy and a social justice impact strategy. And both of those things have to intersect. So it is a way for us to both find ways to support and elevate the guests that we've had on the show, give them more platforms, try and connect them with each other, see what other resources we can make available to them on the back end, which actually not a lot of folks realize, I think. And then on the front end, I'm trying to develop amazing storytelling that inspires and gets our audience to get their butts off seats and go and actually take action. So, I think instead of thinking of the arts as this very linear thing, when you do have folks of color engaged in the arts, it is implicit in many ways that, being able to move people emotionally, spiritually, but also for the communities is kind of implicit in the work.
That's fantastic. Louis, what do you think about it'd be wonderful to hear your experiences.
God, I don't know where to start. I feel like we've been reeling this off since COP26. But
yeah.
I think, I don't know. I mean, my angle is as a musician, first and foremost, I've always been, I guess, is trying to communicate something, but using art to do that. And I also am a scientist as well. I studied zoology, and like, as you described, I'm a massive nature geek. But I feel like the science has been, crystal clear for such a long time. The issue isn't with the science. It's everyone knows what's going on. The issue is with communicating and making people feel like it's an issue that relates to them. And I felt like that was what was so lacking, particularly coming from like an inner city background such as mine, and people I grew up with, people of color, have not felt nature was something that was even a resource for them to explore, let alone something that's valuable for them to protect. So I think that, a couple of the lines that you read out was how I kind of tried to find that intersectionality, but also that crossover of like, why this matters, and connecting the dots between where we're from and where we live. And start to bring in this too often ignored colonial legacy to the climate story that goes on, hundreds of years, but we're still not even taught about it in school. We live in a country that's in denial of its role, just from a historical point of view, on colonialism. So it's difficult we're working on the back foot, trying to get people to understand that colonialism is also the number one contributor to this issue of climate crisis we're in.
Right. And just to build on that, actually, like the way that folks of color will also tend to be described as urban, which again is like a further dissociation from nature, first of all, because it's presuming that there is no nature in the cities. We still drink water, we still feel air on the skin, we feel like the elements wherever we go. Nature is everywhere around us, whether we're in the city or not. But also, a lot of our families are still in colonial countries or post-colonial countries, and they do live on land or live in rural areas. I know a lot of my family do. And then also in some such situations, you've got folks whose lineage were, enslaved or were forced, subjected to forced labor in rural spaces to produce, food or other resources for colonial masters. So it's all there in our history, but we are sort of consistently presumed and excommunicated from that heritage all the time.
Yeah, 100%. Sorry, just to carry on that point a little bit, because I did my whole speech at COP26 was about trying to navigate this like long arc of a story of why we've been so dissociated from nature and alienated from nature as people of color, particularly here in the UK, but also in the West. And yeah, the wording urban is a huge one. Any art we put out, anything to do with our culture is labeled urban immediately. And I think the removal of us from nature, from being people that fundamentally were connected to the land spiritually, through survival, through religion, through societies and communities, that were all once indigenous, and then you bring in colonialism and slavery, and fast forward hundreds of years and even bringing people back to rebuild Britain after the war, it's always been to serve a function of labor. So you kind of see it to the point where we've been more and more disconnected and severed from our connection to nature. So we suddenly find ourselves urbanized, quote unquote urbanized, without really realizing the true extent and true damage of what's happened. And I think you can see that in the average, if you look across different ethnic minority groups in the UK, the average is like 97%, I think 97.6% live in cities. So you can kind of see how this lie of that we have to be stuck to the cities has been perpetuated over the years.
I mean, there is definitely like a safety issue there for me personally. Like, I live in New York City. I've been there for 17 years, but I'm from London. But to leave the city is always a thing of, it is about leaving your safe space, certainly. Like, there is also this there's reason to be fearful of rural spaces because we're not accepted in those regions, usually. Even though, again, that is where, for many of us, our heritage comes from. But it is amazing to see that there are movements of Black and brown folks that are now trying to, address that emotional state, and also the policy shifts that need to happen to be able to accommodate more folks of color as well. That's both in terms of housing as well as just being able to access public lands as well.
When you guys are talking about that, it reminds me of all the kind of groups that have kind of come together recently more. Like, there's like groups like Black Girls Camping, Black Girls Hiking, Black Men's Walking.
Bird watching, birding.
So I feel like what's interesting is there are a lot of POC people in urban spaces that are starting to access nature, but in a group,
exactly,
to feel that they can. And what's fascinating is that history that you're both referring to of colonial, the dynamic between urban and rural. When you start trying to dive in, I worked on Colonial Countryside project with the National Trust. Have you seen the media backlash on that? The project was basically, there were 10 national National Trust properties. These are all in rural spaces. And they picked 10 that had been, built on the legacy of enslaved people. Like, that's just the reality of Britain, right? It's everywhere. So it's not just that these legacies are in our cities. They're also in these rural grand properties that wealthy, slave owning kind of, people built these grand homes on the back of that labor. And so how the National Trust has been trying to engage with that work, and the backlash, the absolute media backlash on that work is shocking, actually. You're seeing what happens. And I was speaking to Dr. Sarah Salim earlier, and she was talking about this kind of what's happening to academics or journalists or people who write, who are doing this work, and the kind of the kind of political state that we're living in under this government, which is, this is not a government that wants to engage with these questions. And that kind of, it's almost what we're, you talked about being on the back foot, Louis, about us, all of us, because how do we even get on the same page if people are not taught? It's not even in our education system. So the ignorance, there's an amazing quote I saw with, from James Baldwin: ignorance allied with power is the most ferocious enemy justice can have. And this is the issue. Like, we are really living in an age where we're resisting. We're aware of it as individuals because we're, you know, black, ethnic minority, you know, POC, whatever terminology you want it, we're basically racialized as non-white. So we're intimately aware of how that impacts on us.
I would say
you know,
to that, you know, I've spoken to you both about this before, and you know, the UK loves to condescend the States on this issue.
Yeah.
I actually saw like a BBC interview the other day with a white woman doing an interview with a black man, saying, you know, why is it that you think white Americans don't want to address slavery in the US? It's just like, is this some kind of a weird joke? Like, the US is easily 10 to 15 years ahead of the UK on any of these conversations, because at least in the US, you hear the term slavery in education, right? You might not agree with it, you might push back against it. Plenty of people are with critical race theory right now, but they still know that it happened. I spent 14 years in the education system in the UK, and I didn't learn or hear a single sentence spoken about colonization, let alone British slavery. It's still presumed as something that is an American effort. And so what progress can we possibly make in the UK without knowing that history? And there is starting to be that movement now from second, third generation immigrant folks of color in the UK who are sort of making their way to British history, British colonial history, by way of what's happening in the States, like through the death of George Floyd and all of those horrific oppressive systems, only then looping back to what's happening in the UK. But for me personally, you know, I grew up in white English middle class suburbia. Like, assimilation is the only way you can really get things done. You have to assimilate to the mainstream culture, which is overwhelmingly led by English references, you know, in the arts, in history, in politics, in every context. Like, that is how you get to university. It's, if you're lucky, if it's how you, you know, get your friends that help you get your job, and that's how you get your income. So if you have to scrape off your culture in order of being able to get along, really, or tokenize it, where it becomes food, or it becomes, you know, costumed clothing, or it becomes music or something like that. It's very like compartmentalized. But for folks of color to be able to actually have a relationship with their culture, unless you're, you know, born into a community that looks like you, which I was not, you don't really have much access. You know, it's very difficult to find pride in, you know, you find yourself, you know, those issues of self-hate or condescension, or, you know, of your own culture, presumed primitivism. And I'd say that, you know, if I hadn't moved to the States to start a journey learning about my racial identity, which will take the rest of my life probably, and it was my Black friends who could see that, you know, who were so open and welcoming to me in a way I was like, everyone's so friendly in New York, what's the deal? But it's because they knew what was ahead of me before I did, you know. So we've got this issue in the UK of folks who are still, you know, forced to commit to their assimilated personalities. And then you've got folks of color who are now breaking away from it, learning about their colonial history, and trying to find ways now to disseminate that information to our peers to help build those communities out, you know, because it's not just for ourselves, it is for our white friends and peers as well. You know, it's the same exact issues that have oppressed us that continue to oppress them as well in many, many, many ways. So that to me is where the system change begins. Boom! I just mic dropped that, actually. It's 8 o'clock. I'm quite impressed with myself.
Everything. We're getting a lot of hearts. We're getting a lot of hearts.
I think the it's interesting. We've spoken about this so much before.
Yeah.
Like for me as a Londoner, like born and raised, I mean, it's a bit more complicated than that because I'm from everywhere. But also as like a mixed race Londoner, I mean, that was a whole separate time. I remember when being mixed race meant you were literally separated from every other race. When I was like 15, 16. And there's a lot more unity here now, for sure. But weirdly, New York for me has always been a place of like respite from here. It's always been somewhere I can recharge my batteries and kind of actually get in touch with my identity a little bit, because it was the first time I'd experienced true like collective community as like a young Black culture, and I was like accepted into that almost immediately in a really amazing way. And I definitely had an advantage of going in as a musician, but I feel like I think the awareness of like a shared experience was so much deeper and so much more organized over there, that it felt like coming back here was always like almost archaic. And also there's a lot of differences in, you know, just the ability to express anger is different in the US and here. We live in I think the capital of apathy in the world. I think it's the most apathetic place in the world, and it goes really badly with denial of like history. And I think, you know, kind of going back to what you were saying, Fozia, that is how do we make like these things be even accepted when the people that are in charge are the people that have benefited from slavery? I mean, we only just stopped paying reparations for the in 2015 for like, you know, people like me who Caribbean descent. I was paying taxes on my ancestors, buying my ancestors' freedom to the people that enslaved them until 2015. I mean, that's crazy.
Yeah,
it couldn't be more crazy.
It's absolutely shocking. And that historical, you know, that in itself, I remember that when it came out, that people, we were all paying our taxes still to families that had benefited from
slave owning families.
And the fact that was in, and this is the key issue, it was embedded in our financial systems here. It's still, it's not in the past. So when people say, oh no, it's in the past, it's like, no, the government was still paying, paying back these people. And so, and so how do we then create change in, and especially with the arts? Like, look, we're here. Tate Modern, that came from sugar. You know,
I know. When I discovered that, the Tates, I was just like, wait, what? Like, this is Tate Sugar.
Yeah, absolutely.
No wonder they got the money to build these massive art places.
Yeah. So this is, and Sarah talked about the importance of storytelling for empire building. So part of the reason there was such a huge investment in, these museums, like the British Museum, or these art, these art institutes, it was about power. It was absolute power. It was about, and how do we reckon with that within all of these institutions that we're working in? And so part of the reason a key part of today has been to frame this international festival to say, look, we're not going to create change. We're not co-creating anything until we start trying to engage with how that the use of resources in the arts, the use of the lack of shared kind of collaborative working that both of you have talked about, this wonderful collective spirit and collaboration that you find yourselves in New York. And I wonder whether that's to do with, I think for a lot of folks of color here, there's a real sense of there's not enough to go around funding pots, so you get this kind of very competitive, like uncollaborative way of working. Like I'm talking about with other POC as well. Like, whereas that's one of the reasons I set up Dhaqan Collective, because we're just out here trying to work nomadically, which is definitely about sharing resources and really connecting up.
And it's designed in that way. I just think the UK is designed across that. It's keep people on the threshold of like desperation, and they can't unify.
Yeah, absolutely. And so
I mean, I just went and spoke at huge conference, like an umbrella organization of funding foundations, and it turns out that only 3% of philanthropic funds are directed to climate right now. And that's climate in general, 3%. And so when climate is affecting overwhelmingly folks of color, Black and brown and indigenous folks around the world, who do not have access to a lot of these spaces, especially hiring spaces, imagine what scraps we're having to like fight over, you know?
Yeah.
So I think to answer your question, it's the same in every sector, not even just the arts. This year I've spoken to, you know, the psychiatrists and lawyers and artists and filmmakers and, you know, all kinds of folks. And we're not getting anything done until we start hiring folks of color in to, to restructure how we communicate out. You know, we don't need it explained to us. We don't need it to be managed. We don't, the presumption that you need to have an Oxbridge degree or you need to have come from a particular background or particular kind of access. I mean, Mothers of Invention is one small example of how talent, creativity, ingenuity, intelligence live in absolutely every single faction of society. I've met and interacted with and are now in community with so many absolutely prolific women, girls, gender non-conforming folks who don't have those kinds of backgrounds and are doing incredible, incredible work. You know, it is, so on one end, it's like, let us in. We know what we're doing. You know, impact is not something that is segregated out from the work that we do. It is implicit.
Yeah.
And then the other end of it is organizing in the way that you are, Fuzia, you know, like doing it ourselves, you know, and then trying to get in and around the issue from both directions, finding ways to organize with our peers. To be able to get things done also is, you know, it has to happen at both ends. I don't think it's one or the other. It has to be both.
Yeah. I think it's, I think my opinions changed quite dramatically since COP26. I think for context, so I made a film a few years ago in the last election, trying to get young people of color to vote based on climate issues, and the whole tagline I came up with was, you know, where we live is destroying where we're from. All these flags that we rep at Notting Hill Carnival, that we get gassed about being from, the stories that we tell of our, you know, parents and grandparents, and if we're lucky enough, we get to visit as much as possible as well. These places are on the front line, and trying to get that through. But then it's also like, actually, you know, us young people have these solutions because we have the stake in this. We have so much more to lose. So why are we not being let into the rooms? And is it going to make a difference, us voting based on this, if the voting system's completely designed for us to lose every election? You know, we need the voting age to be 16. It's insane that it's not, because why would you not put the people who have the longest to live at the front of the decisions? The whole system that we're working with here doesn't make sense to me anymore. And I think we're working within a structure that doesn't have the capacity to even allow us that space or voice, and I'm not even sure we should be trying to get it. I kind of feel like there needs to be a whole there needs to be a whole fall of capitalism, to be honest. There needs to be a revolution, and it's difficult because we have 9 years before we are in a serious place. We have 9 years to sort our whole situation of way we approach living on this planet. Is that enough time for capitalism to fall? I don't think so. But I think we need to stop thinking. We need to basically move away from colonial solutions to colonial problems. I think there's no way we're ever going to solve this from the people that have created this problem in the first place.
Absolutely.
And the West is responsible for, if you look at it historically, they always look at China and India as like huge emitters alongside the US and Europe. But if you look at it historically, they're not even on the map on the top 10, because Europe and America is responsible for 92% of the emissions. If you go back to colonial times. So it's just like, are they ever going to accept responsibility on that scale in the current system that we have? And I don't see it happening without there being a revolution, personally.
Yeah,
I do think that climate is going to be an interesting conduit to that conversation, because when people start realizing, and unfortunately in the global north, no one, to Louis' point, people are mostly apathetic until it's literally on their doorstep. They don't tend to reach out for context. But, oh God, I just lost my train of thought. What was I just saying? What just happened?
They don't reach out for context. The people are apathetic. The culture of apathy.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank God this is a really informal conversation. Otherwise, but I think that colonization. The Industrial Revolution is the thing that gets talked about as the marker of the beginning of climate change. When people start realizing, like, oh my God, what is climate change and where did it come from? Oh, well, it began with the Industrial Revolution. Well, who created the Industrial Revolution? Well, it began, in Britain. Well, where did they even get the money from to build these machines and do this stuff? Well, it was colonization. Well, what's colonization? What's that about? And having to go back and back and back and back until we start being forced to learn, because people are so freaked out by how this could even happen in the first place. We're going to have to start undoing some of these structures just from learning about where climate comes from, I think.
Yeah,
I think the indigenous, like you saying, I mean, and I think we both had this experience from COP26 was like, I don't even know what the word is that kind of justifies it, but kind of mind expanding conversations and listening to indigenous communities at COP26, because they have no problem understanding that colonialism was the beginning of climate change, because I think it's 95% of the indigenous population of the Americas was killed from the first instance of colonialization.
I think it's higher than that, actually. Yeah.
I've actually got the figure in front of me. It's 95%.
Ooh, okay. Excuse me.
Man. It's in the speech. I mean, it probably is higher than that, because it's an estimate. Like, how can you estimate that?
Yeah.
But the thing is that's such an extreme level of destruction of societies that were intrinsically connected to nature and understood how to live with it harmoniously. So that's a loss not only to them in terms of lives and history, but it's a loss to humanity and how to exist on this planet.
Yeah.
And then you repeat the story again by bringing 15 million African slaves over to fill the place that was left. And you're funding the Industrial Revolution, but also Industrial Revolution needed space and workers in the factories back in the UK. So not only was this happening here, but people that were connected to the land in Europe. But if we look at the UK, especially, the peasants were removed from their land by landowners, and that's why we see the UK is like one of the most land controlled. I think it is the most land owned and controlled country in the world. And it means, basically, we suddenly jump forward to now 3% of ecosystems in the world are untouched, because this colonialism goes hand in hand with environmental destruction and the destruction of indigenous rights. So what we need to do is put these indigenous leaders in in charge of making the decisions, because they're on the front lines everywhere across the board. And like, you know, you constantly say, Thimali, like indigenous groups, what, make up 6%, is it? And but cover 85% of biodiversity.
6% of the world's population are indigenous now, due to only 6% due to colonization. But yeah, 80% of the planet's biodiversity is protected and nurtured by indigenous people. Like, we are completely indebted to them, you know. And Louis' statistic on Turtle Island, North America, you know, that genocide of Native Americans triggered a small ice age that was experienced in the UK, in fact. But also, you know, when we talk about that, it means that, you know, those people, there was no longer anyone stewarding land in the way that it needed to, you know, in a completely interdependent way, as opposed to a way of domination, which obviously comes with capitalism and colonialism, is like a domination of people and planet, as opposed to interdependency. But then a further sort of oppression of the landscape with planting monocultures and such like, which, you know, then you're dealing with soil erosion and depletion of, you know, very, very, you know, fragile, ancient biodiversity in those areas. So it has enormous knock-on effects, and we think it's 9 years right now, but we don't know what destroying areas of, you know, very fragile biodiversity is going to do in terms of, you know, further tipping points. And that could be tens, but it could be millions of different tipping points that we see, that don't just occur within a small region, but happen across an entire continent or all the world. You know, Louis had a fantastic you know, anecdote about the Sahara Desert, like fertilize. What was it about fertilizing the Amazon?
Yeah, I mean, it's essentially that how connected the world is. The Amazon doesn't exist by the fertilizer. The soil quality is really poor, so that why, you know, Bolsonaro and other leaders in the South America think cutting down the Amazon, farming there, is a good idea is just beyond me. But it's really poor quality soil because it's quite it's based off basically fertilization from dust that comes from the Sahara, which was an old sea. So you have ancient fish and all the phosphorus that's come from that, and it blows over in winds and fertilizes one of our main lungs on the planet. Also the Congo rainforest as well. But it's, you know, that knock-on effect is what I think I'm really terrified, and what's so sad. It's like, you don't have to spend that long learning about nature to realize how fundamentally interconnected everything is. You know, I think one of the best things I heard that represented this, a talk that we both went to actually, Thimali, which was this indigenous group based in British Columbia, and really, really small group. I think it was like 168 people that are really doing a battle against the Canadian government. But they were talking about how, you know, there used to be so much salmon that they could walk over the river and not get wet, and how salmon aren't actually, it's not entirely accurate to think of them as coming from the ocean. They come from the woods, because you need old growth woodland to create the right type of pools and rivers for the salmon, not only to like climb up and mate and then spawn, but also for them, once they've hatched, for the young salmon to kind of grow in. And young woodland, after being cut down, you can plant new trees, but the young woodland takes so much more water, it doesn't allow these pools to develop. And all the salmon, once they've mated, when they die, they fertilize the wood. So that's why you got these incredible, really unique old growth forests. But, you know, the West has come in and cut all these forests down, and then started also salmon farming, because the salmon starts running out, and they're just attacking it from every side. And you get collapses of systems that don't just spring back. It takes 1 second to cut down a tree, but it takes, 100 years to have an old growth forest. So and then that's, happening across the world, permafrost, releasing gases, what's going to be under the ice? Is there methane reserves that are just going to explode out into our atmosphere? That suddenly we don't have that. We clearly don't have that understanding of our planet, because look at what we're doing to it. So
yeah, absolutely,
it's mad.
It's really sad. And you're talking about here, both of you. I can hear like the frustration, but also the urgency. Like this is, we need urgent kind of responses to this. And a question was just asked about what do you think? How do you think a co-created way? And I think you guys have been speaking to that actually, in terms of we need Indigenous people at the forefront. We need to bring people in. So how do you feel? How would a co-creation help support a better solution? So that's about, I guess, the sharing of resources, the sharing of platforms. But it'd be really good to get your opinions on that.
I mean, go ahead, Louis. Yeah.
Okay. So my whole thing that I'm working on at the moment through my films and my music is trying to get people, the diaspora in the West, to understand, one, where we're from is on the front line, but has contributed the least. But also because we understand we have this, this bridge of a connection to the world and what is going on in the world outside of, our little box of the UK or even box of Europe and the West. We are almost like moles in the system. We have the ability and power to be megaphones for these people that are on the front line, particularly Indigenous groups who share the same, we're talking about shared experience. We share the same experience as people of color, as Indigenous people, but, over hundreds of years. And they're still experiencing it on the front line in the same way that our ancestors experienced in the beginning. So we owe it to them as our brothers and sisters to be their megaphone and to push them and put their voices out above everyone else's. And then ours come next. And any white allies that have these platforms need to not just create programs about us. They need to actually step aside and put us in the rooms to make decisions, because we really understand what's going on. I think the clearest thing that came out of COP for me is everyone understands what needs to be done. We have the solutions. We have the technology. We have the natural solutions. We have the long-running knowledge of how a proper society could exist under environmental justice. But the leaders don't want to act because they do not care enough to.
They shouldn't be called leaders. In fact, that was the whole thing, wasn't it? At COP is we actually have the leaders. Louis and I had an amazing experience in parallel COP. There's the blue zone where the negotiations were happening, the green zone where which was open to the public, which Louis and I were really lucky to speak in. I was on a couple of panels, as was he. But then there's the parallel COP, which was hosted by the COP26 Coalition, which is a coalition of organizations from all over the world, BIPOC-led, where all the real conversations were happening. It's where all the real solutions were happening, all the real conversations. You could meet all the real leaders who are really, really getting this stuff done. It's not, not in a tokenized way, but actual strategy. So my recommendation also would be to follow the work that COP26 Coalition were doing. And exactly as Louis said, Indigenous groups, Indigenous leaders, the answers are here. They've been here. They've always been here. It's something I say also quite frequently these days is an advantage that Mothers of Invention has, being oriented around feminist solutions, is that we are a place to talk about love and kindness and compassion and care and interconnectedness, which are none of these things are deemed climate solutions when you leave that room, you know. But those are the same exact parameters that Indigenous folks are functioning in to problem solve these issues, you know. It's not a coincidence to me that, you know, Indigenous people, women, you know, artists, all people who are having empathic relationships with these issues are also the most, you know, those folks who are pushed to the back of the line. You know, we know it's going to have to take a far more emotional relationship with all of these issues to get it done, you know. Which unfortunately our world leaders are not all that familiar with. And Louis and I, along with a couple of very dear friends, all of colour, we left COP and went to Loch Lomond as a gang of POC brown people, got on a train and went and hiked through the woods, you know, next to the lake, to just be in nature, to be in the place that we were trying to protect and take care of, like the context, you know. And it was beautiful, you know, it was absolutely beautiful, just walking around in the rain, you know, on a foggy day, just brown joy, you know, pure brown joy. And like, why are our leaders not doing that?
Yeah.
Why are they not leaving COP and finding themselves in those spaces?
Being like, it's mental that you don't have to go be in the context of what you're doing, trying to save.
Like the Cambo pipeline is being planned literally miles away from where we were, you know. That is, they need to be in those spaces to know what they save. But also, we all know that nature is a place of sanctuary and calm and sense, you know, humanity, like all those things of what we are protecting. It's not just a nice place to have a hike, it is for our mental health. It is,
absolutely. I love that. Those leaders should have been really, like, it kind of makes sense, doesn't it, intuitively? Why aren't you out there? What does that say to you about the lack of respect they have for the natural environment?
But we're called urban, you know, we're the urbanites. So.
There's a question about from Lucy Paddock, who would like to hear your panel's thoughts on reparations. What about reparations? Well,
it's a small one. I mean, give them.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. That's just a very short answer. Yes, reparations.
Reparations would be great.
They should happen. They should be happening. They should be happening.
I think there's a really brilliant quote that I put in my speech, and it's embarrassingly can't remember who originally said the quote, but the poor countries aren't underdeveloped; they're overexploited. Yeah. So the balance needs to be reset. Everyone needs to be put back, you know, to where it's supposed to be without the exploitation of people and the environment. And that a lot of that will come from reparations. Whether that's reparations just from slavery and colonialism, which does need to happen, considering we have been still paying it until 2015, but also whether that's also reparations for places that are on the front line that haven't contributed to climate change, and giving them the ability to leapfrog in doing the just transition into a greener state and, you know, a Green New Deal type of like economy, basically.
Yeah, one that's not extractive of people and planet.
I mean, yeah, I don't think that our leaders in the UK have any semblance of humanity to even engage this conversation. But it is an issue of resources or power, isn't it? So if you're not going to give us the resources and giving us access to, you know, to get things done, and that, you know, starting with education, free access to free education is just the bare minimum. But then it is also, as we were saying, creating access in work environments, in politics, everywhere. You know, as Louis said, you know, we're not victims of anything. We don't need to be condescended to. We are survivors of some absolute insane crazy. We are the descendants of some absolute insane crazy.
I love
and
that.
Then, you know, on a global, you can quote me on that, Louis. Yes, yes, you're welcome. Crazy. You're welcome. It's probably my New York coming through. But also, like, on a global scale, you know, just in terms of what's happening in the UN, you've got the Green Climate Fund, which has existed as a sort of bank account for, you know, mostly emitting nations, like high emitting nations, to be able to give money for adaptation for more vulnerable countries, things like that. But then there is money going into that pot. But then parallel to that is the Warsaw Mechanism for Loss and Damage, which is never termed as a tool for reparations, but basically is, which says, you know, you completely screwed us. Like, we are in this situation as people who have not contributed to this crisis that are going to have to migrate off our ancestral land because of you.
Yeah.
Like, you owe us big time so that we can start building. And surprise of surprises, there's nothing in there. Like, there's no money in there, because it's not just even about putting money in the pot. It's about admission of something, isn't it?
Yeah,
and no one's willing to admit, you know, that they have done wrong here. We're still in the UK doing, oh, but we gave them roads and bridges. And you took, you know, every feasible resource, you know, that we had to be able to self-sustain and subsist. So,
and when you talk about that loss of ancestral land, it's not just loss of ancestral land. There's a loss of culture that happens. So I see it with my mom is a nomadic pastoralist in Somalia, Ethiopia borders. Her family would have been living like that for thousands of years. They, you know, and you can see it in the weaving. So my aunt still is a nomadic pastoralist, but it has got unsustainable. So people are having to be forced off because there's just not enough water. There's not enough water. There's not enough. And Somali people are nomad. Like, that is like, going around herding camels, being around, like, we are nomadic people. That's part of our, you know, we've got like 46 words for camel. We were the first people to domesticate camels, you know, to adapt to that harsh environment. So, you know, and with that, you've got like different folk songs, but you've got weaving techniques from plants, and it's what I was talking to my mom about it, and she was saying you can't, because I was thinking about how Dhaqan Collective can try and engage with some of those traditional crafting methods, and she was saying it's all dying out. Like, how do you do it? Like, because these people, you know, so it's like these patterns that have been passed on for thousands of years, they're not even. So it's more than a loss of. It's like a loss of culture. Like, even if it's not considered high art, it's beautiful weaving techniques, it's beautiful patterns, and it's all things that are to do with living sustainably with your environment. And so I really feel that kind of that real injustice that's happening to people who, you know, who lose all sorts of, like, we're kind of lost. You know, we were talking about this being here in this country, we're a bit lost because we were taken from
definitely.
We were, you know, so how do you relate back to nature? And I think I think everything you guys have been saying is so wonderful and refreshing, and, you know, we know it, but I think it's something I hope that the audience or anyone in power, you know, really takes note of some of the key points you're both making, which is, you know, I love what you said, Louis, get out the way for a start. Like, you want system change. There are a lot of people that need to start getting out the way. You want to be a white ally, get out the way. Pass the resources on to the people that are doing the work at the forefront, at the front lines. And for a start, look at your organizations. Employ more POC, not from a tokenistic point of view, but because this is how some of this real change is going to happen. And also, you said something, Thim, when we spoke last week about this sense of doing us a favor. This isn't about co-creating change. You're not doing anyone a favor. There's no favors being done. Like, what's happening is you need the right people in the room to affect social change and disrupt that power dynamic. So
in what universe are you ever going to come up with a comprehensive solution to anything with only one demographic of human in the room?
Absolutely.
How?
Exactly.
You know, you're going to end up with half-baked solutions to everything, and you will be back there in a year's time, in 3 years' time, 5 years' time, 10 years' time, readdressing the same thing. You know, the only way out of this mess is to make friends and be in community with people that do not look like you, you know, that are not the same sexuality as you, the same gender as you, the same economic background as you, the same physical abilities as you. That is the only way we are getting out of this mess. The only way. And just on your point about, you know, culture, between 200 million and 1.2 billion people are heading out our way, migrating due to the climate crisis.
I have to stop. This is amazing. We're going to be shut off soon because everything's ending. But I love everything that you said. Please, anyone, go follow both Thimali and Louis VI. They're doing some amazing work on climate collapse. So thank you so much for everything, both of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having us.
Love you, Fuzzy.
I love you too. Well,